seated, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. You may be seated.
All right, are we ready? I'll take that as a yes. Okay.
Jurors in the courtroom, Your Honor. Jurors may be seated. All jurors are present and accounted for, Your Honor.
Thank you, Deputy. Ladies and gentlemen, were you all able to abide by my instructions during the recess?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for returning. We're ready to begin.
Thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Dr. Roy Bedard.
Just come this way for me, all the way around this way for me, okay?
I'm not standing right here, raise your right hand and face the clerk, please. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give in this call shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Michaels.
Please state your name.
Roy Bedard,
Spell your last name, please.
B-E-D-A-R-D.
And what is your current profession?
I am a law enforcement trainer.
And how long have you been a law enforcement trainer?
Oh, I think 35 years.
And we're going to get into that a little bit more. Let's go over your education. I called you doctor, so you have a PhD?
I do.
And where's that from?
It is from Florida State University.
And what is your PhD in?
Educational psychology. My major is sports psychology.
And what was your dissertation?
It was on decision-making under pressure specific to law enforcement officers.
Now, you have a bachelor's degree from where?
Also Florida State University.
Okay. And I see an MSc degree.
My master's is also from Florida State University.
And what's your master's in?
Also in educational psychology.
Okay, now you listed on your CV something called Lively Law Enforcement Academy. What's Lively Law Enforcement Academy?
So it doesn't exist anymore. When I went to the police academy, it was run by a vocational school called Lively, and the Law Enforcement Academy was one of the divisions and curriculum of that vocational school.
Okay, so let's talk about police academy. So were you a police officer?
Yes.
Tell me about your history as a police officer.
I began as a police officer in 1987. I worked for the Florida State University Police Department. I moved to the Tallahassee Police Department in 1990 and continued in full-time service until 1996. I went into the reserve status in 1996 and continued with the Tallahassee Police Department until 2015. I retired from the agency, and then in 2019, I believe, I became an administrative reserve for the Tallahassee Community College Police Department.
Okay. And so you're still active in that particular role?
Yes.
Now let's talk about this Lively Law Enforcement Academy. There were certain affiliations you had with that academy. For instance, I see one that says CJSTC. What does that mean?
So in the state of Florida, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement commissions a group of commissioners to govern criminal justice. So the CJSTC is the Criminal Justice Standards and Training Commission that writes curriculum and otherwise interacts with basic level students, as well as agencies for in-service requirements. So they sort of oversee law enforcement. They also issue the standards by which law enforcement officers are permitted to be employed.
And when you say curriculum, are you talking about manuals, books, that sort of thing?
Yes.
And you were an instructor?
Yes.
Okay, so at the Lively Law Enforcement Academy, you were instructor?
Yes.
Now, you also instructed CJSTC as a general topics instructor,
Yes.
as a firearms instructor.
Yes.
You also instructed in the field of advanced injury and death investigations, correct?
Correct.
There's several more that include interviews and interrogations, is that right?
Yes.
And a handful more. Now, tell me about the Florida Criminal Justice Executive Institute. What's that?
The Florida Criminal Justice Executive Institute is also run by FDLE, and it is a executive institute that mostly does advanced and specialized training to administrations, to executives within law enforcement.
Okay. And were you an instructor there?
Yes.
And so one of the things you instructed, I see, elder abuse investigation. Tell me about that.
That actually was a class that I took from that. I did not teach that one. It was precisely as the title says. It was about investigating elder abuse.
All right, so that was a class you took there.
Yes.
Now, you currently, in addition to being consultant, do you own a marketing business as well?
I do.
Tell me about that.
I have a company that is called Rapid Rotation Baton. It has a flagship product that is a police baton with a specialized holster. I also make other types of equipment, including handcuffs and other holsters and belt systems and things like that that police officers, correctional officers, and military folks wear. The corporation is a DBA, RRB Systems International, which is the DBA for Rapid Rotation Baton, which is what I mostly consult under.
Okay, now, you're a consultant, so prosecutor always likes to ask, so let me ask you, are you getting paid for your time here by the defense?
Yes.
And how much are you getting paid per hour?
$300.
Okay. And let me ask you this, we're going to get there, but you testified as an expert for the state of Florida, right?
I have.
Not too long ago.
That's true.
This same very office,
Yes.
in fact, one of the prosecutors that's here was involved in that case.
Correct.
And did you charge the state of Florida for your services?
I did.
And what was your fee?
Same fee.
Now, let me look at some of your other experience. I see 2005 to present, Lazarus Mining LLC. Tell me about that.
This was a mining corporation. I was hired to provide consultation and actually boots on the ground services for in terms of their security. It was actually in not the city of, but the country of Colombia. It was a alluvial mining operation.
And so they requested your expertise
Yes.
in what, training, security? Tell me what you did there.
Actually involved in setting up a security system, which did involve training as well as various security analysis of that particular area.
And was that to protect the assets as well as the individuals working there?
Exactly.
Now, you have a title in your CV called Achievements and Titles. So when I see subject matter expert in instructor techniques assigned to reviewing and updating state general instructor training curriculum for FDLE, what does that mean?
So the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Criminal Justice Standards and Training Commission assembles a group of subject matter experts from throughout the state of Florida who sit together and design curriculum. At times they update curriculum, and it's an ongoing process, a work in progress. And I am one of the identified subject matter experts for the state of Florida for developing police and corrections curriculum.
Okay, and so that's general instructor training. What about this? I see same FDLE subject matter expert assigned to updating state defense tactics curriculum and state instructor defensive tactics. Same sort of thing, helping?
It is. There's been many iterations. I've been doing this since the 90s, and so as the state either updates or sometimes completely tears down and redesigns courses, I'm often called for assistance with those projects.
And it looks like those are from 2014, 2013. You have several more instances where you were tasked with aiding Florida Department of Law Enforcement in creating and updating curriculum. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I see one from 1999 to 2003, FDLE, again, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, subject matter expert in defense tactics. So again, you were assigned to drafting state defensive tactics curriculum and state instructor curriculum. Similar sort of thing?
Yes, that was under what we called a CMS curriculum maintenance system that was used back in the late 90s and early 2000s.
And part of your consultation career has not only to do with being a consultant for litigants in court, whether it be an accused in a criminal trial or the prosecution in a criminal trial or civil litigants. In addition to that, you also did some instruction and consultation and presentation internationally. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And I see you've listed, there are several listed on your CV here. Internationally, I see 2019 Dubai Police Department in the United Arab Emirates, non-lethal technology for law enforcement. You're a presenter.
Yes.
Now, how do you end up in the United Arab Emirates?
I work with particular equipment, and oftentimes if there's an order on that equipment, for example, with that one, it was the pepperball system, I wrote that training manual, so I went and presented it to them in a course that involved field applications.
And I see you presented in Spain, Poland, the Virgin Islands, Israel, Colombia, Madrid, Brazil, Germany, and Scotland. Also, Jamaica, St. Martin, and England. So you've been around the world, have you not, in terms of sharing your expertise and training people?
I have.
Now, you also trained here nationally as well, right?
Yes.
Locally and nationally. So let's look at some of these. 2018 Allied Universal Security Services, you were the curriculum writer for Use of Force and Defensive Tactics program for the largest private security provider in North America.
That's correct.
Tell me about that.
So there's a large corporation that employs many different security officers throughout the United States and abroad. And their Use of Force and Defensive Tactics program, I was commissioned to write that for them.
Okay, and in your notes here, you have between 150,000 employees and over 20,000 sites.
Yes.
You've also been a lecturer at the FBI National Academy graduate meeting, right?
Yes,
Daytona Beach, there you lectured on Stand Your Ground.
that's correct.
You also did a Florida High Liability Police Trainers Conference for the Florida Public Safety Institute. What's the Florida Public Safety Institute?
So that is a organization that is now at the Pat Thomas Law Enforcement Academy in that same location in the city of Tallahassee. And the Florida Public Safety Institute is providing services to law enforcement agencies throughout the state of Florida as well as other states that may come do training in that area.
Okay. You've also presented to the Florida High Liability Police Trainers Conference, Investigating Stand Your Ground, a presenter there as well.
Yes.
Now, I see Florida Public Safety Institute. That's up in North Florida?
Yes, that was the one we just talked about. That is there in Tallahassee. It's actually in a city called Havana, but it's just at the outskirts of Tallahassee.
And I think up there, because I went to school there, they call it Havana.
That may be so.
Now, that says lead instructor, FDLE, CGSTC, Defensive Tactics Instructor course. What's that?
To be a defensive tactics instructor in the state of Florida, you have to go through a course called the Florida Defensive Tactics Instructor course. Now, I've both obviously been through that course, and I am certified by the CJSTC as an instructor, but I've also provided that course in many different occasions.
And you also educate, for instance, the Public Defender's Office.
Yes.
Looks like in Fort Myers, self-defense and combat stress.
Correct.
You also spoke to these lawyers in 2012 in Naples, Florida Public Defender's Office. You were presenter for the self-defense, defense, stand your ground, and castle doctrine.
Yes.
And these are all pages of when you presented and some of the instruction you provided, so I'm just looking through them. We went through the the fact that it was international as well as national. So it's not only in Florida, you also have conferences in St. Louis, for instance, all throughout the U.S.
That is correct.
I see something that says karate competition resume. So tell me, were you involved in the martial arts?
I was, for most of my life, still am.
Okay. Tell us about your competitive career in the martial arts.
My competitive career, when I was 18, I earned a place on the United States karate team and began traveling with that team throughout various parts of the world, competing in various competitions. And I think I have those listed as well.
In this case, you also, I should say on your CV, you've also listed some publications and productions that you've been involved in. Publications, you mentioned your dissertation already. I'm looking at one that says Florida Criminal Justice Standards and Training Commission. That's that FCJSTC we've been looking at, right?
That's correct.
And it says Instructor Curriculum, Defensive Tactics, Use of Force, and Survival Stress. Tell me about that. What did you do there?
Again, this is the curriculum that every police officer in the state of Florida and correctional officer has to go through to be able to get their police standards. So I was on the subject matter expert team in writing that curriculum.
Okay. Now, you've helped write the training manual for ground defense for FDLE?
Yes, you're talking about the ground fight course?
Yes.
Yes, that was a corporate course. I have presented it throughout the United States.
Okay. Now, you have been qualified previously, have you not, in the field of use of force,
Yes,
defense tactics,
yes,
human factors,
yes,
okay, among others, right?
yes,
And have you testified in state and federal court?
I have.
And both for both sides?
Yes,
Now, let's talk about use of force. Use of force is something that you train police officers on.
yes,
Both police officers that have experienced police officers.
yes,
Do you also train, for instance, I don't know if rookies is the right word, what do you call it when you're recruits?
recruits, yes.
And in fact, right now, did you come here breaking away from some training you were providing somewhere else?
Yes, in Seminole County.
And so what were you doing there?
I'm teaching actually a legal course to what we call a crossover class. These are officers that are currently in corrections but are crossing over to get their license for law enforcement.
Now, let's talk first about this, the subject of use of force. Can you give me a three-word definition for use of force?
A three-word definition for use of force?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know about that, how complete it will be. It is the philosophical underpinnings of force I used for.
Okay. Maybe it's a clumsy, is it response to threat?
It is response to threat, yes.
All right, now let's talk about, you've already established that that's something that you teach police agencies, you teach civilians as well?
Yes.
Now, that use of force, does it always involve a firearm?
No,
Okay, so could it be something other than a firearm?
it can. There are a lot of different tools that can be used by individuals to defend themselves.
Okay, so it could be a weapon
Yes,
of some sort other than a firearm,
yes,
or some other object,
yes,
and it may be even a fist.
yes.
Okay. Now, let's talk about use of force. So there's use of force, there's a kind of a threat assessment involved in the use of force. Is that true, or do I have that wrong?
No, you're correct.
So tell me what that means, without going in any sort of model or explanation, aside from what does threat assessment mean?
Threat assessment occurs with individuals who are situationally aware. Anytime that you are in any given location, you're monitoring for danger. It's a natural human instinct to constantly monitor for danger. And if something happens in an environment in which a danger signal is noted by an individual, they will begin the threat assessment to determine what level of threat that would be. and it would offer a variety of different cognitive features, in fact, even some physiological features, if the challenge perhaps turns into a specific threat.
Okay. And without commenting on what a proper response may or may not be, when you say certain cognitive, would you use cognitive?
Yeah, some cognitive features. I mean, things.
Tell me about some of those cognitive features.
Well, for example, strategy. Like, if you feel that there's a threat in the environment, what is the strategic best thing to do at that particular moment? That is a rational determination of what is my appropriate response to the threat that I happen to perceive or the challenge that I happen to perceive. And those are different things, challenge and threat. If you, for example, are very close to someone who you think is a threat, a positive cognitive reaction would be to create more distance, for example, or it may be to raise your hands up to protect the vital areas of your body, including your head, your throat, accordingly. So those are features that are taught, they're learned. In some cases, they may even be slightly instinctual. I think we do draw these things from our instincts, and then we codify them in coursework.
And you said certain physiological features?
There are a lot of physiological features as a challenge evolves to a threat. And the basic distinction is when you have a challenge, the assumption is you have the proper coping mechanisms for dealing with it. And those coping mechanisms may be environmental, they may be weapons-oriented, they may be the way you talk to somebody, perhaps in a form of what's known as de-escalation. But when those features are overcome and the challenge evolves to where you no longer have the coping mechanisms, for example, the attack has started and you're not able to avoid the attack, to run from it, to perhaps even fight it because maybe there's differences in size or difference in the availability of weapons or things like that, then that challenge becomes a threat. And when the threat occurs, there are physiological features that start to happen as part of our natural system for self-protection.
And so before we get there, let me go back so I can understand how it progresses. The situation progresses from situational awareness, which means, correct me if I'm wrong, that kind of what it sounds like. You're aware of where you're at, your surroundings.
Right, that's correct.
And somehow just being there with another individual or something else in the environment that could cause a threat.
That would be your threat assessment. When you identify a threat, of course, we are very visual creatures. Most of the information we gather from the environment comes from our vision. So as we're situationally aware, we're paying attention to different things in the environment that may be harmful to us. If we start to attend to a particular thing and identify it as a threat, then we go into threat assessment. For example,
how do we identify something as a threat with our situational awareness? What are some of the cues? What are some of the things that we should look for?
Well, sights and sounds, for sure. I mean, for example, if you step out into the street and you hear the rev of a motor, your threat assessment would perhaps be to get out of the street. So you can hear certain features in the environment, you can see certain features in the environment that would dictate to you that there is an appropriate response to try to avoid danger. For example, moving close to something. When a rattlesnake shakes its tail, it's usually good advice to step back away from that. So that would be a threat assessment, and it would be a reaction to that threat by trying to minimize the chance of harm.
Okay. And when you talk about a physiological aspect, the physiological aspect of this threat assessment, tell me what you mean by that.
I think a lot of times when you teach use of force in defensive tactics, there's a tendency to think that everything is rational, everything is cognitive, and we're capable of thinking about things as if we were sitting in a desk, perhaps learning about it. But in the real world, to use a cliche, there are other things that are happening. There are things that are happening physiologically, chemical and electrical signals that are reacting to your environment as well, things that you don't have control over, often referred to as the fight-flight syndrome. This syndrome changes the way you perceive things. It changes your abilities, your competencies. It can shunt blood from one part of your body to another part of your body, changes the way you see. It can generate things like tunnel vision. It can even turn off your ears, something we call auditory exclusion.
And those are kind of artifacts of stress, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit when we talk to human factors, but those are the kind of things that we're talking about. And as I'm talking to you, I can understand that threat assessment kind of boils over into risk assessment. They go hand in hand. Do I have that right?
They do. So once you identify your threat and you start to make cognitive features about that, then you have to do a risk assessment to determine what your best course of action will be.
Okay. Now, when you're identifying a threat, you talked about environment. So, for instance, do you train that? And it almost sounds like we should know this, but certainly, do you train regarding the light available to assess what is a threat now?
Yes, again, being visual creatures like we are, light is critically important to being able to make an accurate determination of what a threat is.
And so when you say an accurate determination of what a threat is, does that mean, at least at this level, trying to determine what the appropriate response is?
Yes.
Now, so when we're talking about light and darkness, you said because we're visual. Tell me about that. Why is a dark situation potentially presents more of a threat if there's another individual that now is becoming a threat? How does that cause that to be more of an acute threat or more of a threat?
Well, at the most extreme with light conditions, if you can't see it, certainly it doesn't figure into your threat assessment. So if it's incredibly dark, for example, you may not see something that is very harmful, and you may not know to do anything about it. As the light improves, you may still have an impoverished view. You may not be able to see things clearly. But for example, somebody who uses a training firearm, it could be painted blue. You wouldn't be able to tell if you were, for example, a police officer pulling up on two people playing with blue firearms, whether or not they were actual firearms or not, because the blue color is only available to you when it's light outside. So as light starts to improve, so too does our acuity, our ability to actually determine what something is, what it means, and it will figure into our risk assessment, our threat assessment appropriately. We do have what are known as mistake of fact. These mistakes are usually when we either don't have enough time to see something or we're seeing something in an impoverished way. We don't have a full picture of it.
And that doesn't mean the person was wrong in what they were thinking, right?
No.
And let me ask you this. So we talked about dark, pitch black. That's an easy one. You can't see it. It's more of a dangerous situation, to use a layman's
That is
term.
correct.
As it gets a little more, as there becomes more light in the environment, if it's dim light, does that still affect one's ability to perceive danger and to properly assess the threat? Or to assess the threat?
It can. I mean, obviously in police work, we have tools to make adjustments. For example, flashlights. But of course, that's not always the case when you're dealing with, for example, a civilian set who may not run around with a flashlight. So we try to mitigate the problem as best that we can. But anytime you don't have a complete visual picture of something, it could be said that you don't fully understand it.
Okay, so a police officer has a flashlight. Are they taught, well, if you're not sure, if you can't really see or it's dim, go ahead and light them up if you can?
Yes.
Now, you talked about the idea of using your senses to do this kind of risk assessment. What about hearing? How does that affect your ability to assess the threat or to perceive a threat?
Well, hearing is interesting because it's probably earliest of our evolutionary features. We tend to hear things oftentimes before we see them. We can hear things at great distances and usually only see things as they get much closer to us. So our hearing tends to be a little bit more acute, especially when you're dealing with things like reaction time. There's been many studies that show that reaction time is faster when it's auditory.
Approach. And Dr. Bedard, could you slow down just a little
I'm
bit?
sorry.
You're probably killing the court reporter.
we were talking about how the sense of hearing could affect the perception reaction time, and so I don't want to know what studies said. I know that you have a great deal of experience in this field, that you have a great deal of education in this field, that you educate others in this field. So tell me, from your knowledge, how does that affect perception reaction time?
Well, of course, word choice matters. If you can't hear proper word choice, you might not understand a threat in the way that it was intended. There's tone, there's inflection, there's loudness that has to do a lot of times with threat assessment. It's often said that in threat assessment that all creatures will, when threatened, become bigger, they'll get louder, and they will turn colors. And of course, humans are no different. We tend to do that. We pull our shoulders back, we start to holler, and we oftentimes will turn red. So those threat assessments are part and parcel of the risk assessment. What do I do now? And so when you have somebody who's standing in the dark, for example, and perhaps there is some type of a problem with your ability to hear what they're saying, you can't fully understand the threat, and oftentimes these, what we refer to as dymatic threats, where somebody's hollering at you, for example, doesn't really hurt you, but it speaks volumes about what perhaps is coming next. And if you can't focus on those dymatic threats because you simply can't hear them, you will not be able to make an appropriate evaluation of what that threat is.
And what we're talking about now, up to now, that's something you teach, is that something you teach in police academies?
Yes.
And is that something you instruct civilians on?
Yes.
Now, you talked about the auditory and the visual. When we talked about environment, because you said the first step is environment. And so environment obviously includes the senses that we're talking about. And does it also include the place that this takes place? And what I'm getting at is this. Is it part of threat assessment to take as a cue of a threat or a potential threat behavior that would be out of the ordinary in a certain situation or environment? For instance, if somebody came down the aisle, sat in the front row of court, and jumped up and started yelling, would that start your threat assessment of that individual?
Yes.
Why is that?
Because everything has a baseline. So, for example, if you walked into a church and somebody was jumping around and acting differently than the rest of the otherwise quiet church members, that would be a violation of the baseline. You would attend to that and try to figure out what that meant. To the contrary, if you walked into a club and everybody was really quiet, you would wonder what was going on under that circumstance. So baselines are contextual. And when you're dealing with the context of an environment, you're mindful of those baselines. And what calls your attention normally to things as part of your threat assessment is that something is out of the baseline.
Now, you talked about environment, so that's kind of bigger, macro. Let's micro it a little bit. Does it matter one's proximity to a threat?
Yes.
Okay, and tell me why that's important, how close you are.
Proximity, in terms of the angles that you stand at, for example, affording yourself an escape route, those are proximate decisions that have to be made as part of your threat assessment. But also the nature of how close you are to somebody, which is, I think, how you concluded your question to me, will matter because of reaction time.
And so do you look at kind of nonverbal cues to make that threat assessment?
Verbal and nonverbal,
This
yes.
is what I'm getting at. I see a lot of police reports, and the police officer will say, well, he was blading.
Right.
What does that mean?
Blading is a bit of a pugilistic or fighting posture that somebody might take by placing one leg back and leaving the other leg a little bit closer to you. This is typically done in fighting as a preparatory stance, and it also is to minimize target area.
Okay, and so that would be a threat, even though there have been no blows thrown.
Yes, that would be what we would call a pre-fight cue.
Okay. Now, what other cues are we looking for in that environment? So we have a close proximity. We have someplace that is not well lighted. We have some sort of auditory interference.
Excuse me, Judge, I'm going to object to the summing up of testimony. I think this is the second, if not the third time, so I'm going to object to it.
I mean, I can approach if you want. It's not, I could say that if this, that, and that, and that, then ask the question.
All right, I'm going to overrule.
All right.
No objection.
Do those cues, are they cumulative? In other words, the more you have, does it add up to make the situation more of a threat?
Yeah, we would call that the totality of the circumstances, and they are cumulative. When you start adding them together, they're more meaningful than when you take them individually.
So tell me, when you say totality of the circumstances, I kind of know what it means. Tell me what it means in the context of what you instruct police officers, soon-to-be police officers, and civilians. What do you mean by totality of the circumstances as it relates to this idea of threat assessment?
So it encompasses everything you've talked about so far. What is your environment? For example, it's not a good idea to fight on a slippery floor or perhaps a gravelly floor. You want to have better traction, so you'd want to take note of that. If you're about to engage somebody, it has to do with the lighting conditions, whether or not you're capable of seeing. If you have a tool to your avail, for example, a flashlight, you would probably use that. If you don't, you may choose that this is not the best time to go down that dark alley. There are circumstances about vision. As I said, there may be a case of where an individual is partially hidden and you can't quite see what they're doing, and so that would figure into your threat assessment as well. And then there are also individual features, what we call subject factors, like, for example, how old are you and how capable of you are fighting? Are you bigger than the person? Do you have martial arts experience? Do you have a weapon on you? All of those kind of things would be taken into account when you're trying to examine whether or not this is merely a challenge for which you have the appropriate coping mechanisms, or it is a threat for which your coping mechanisms are now exceeded.
And when you say that, these things are this is part of the totality of the circumstances. In other words, that applies to able-bodied people as well as people that are invalids.
Yes, they're just in a different place in their evaluation. I mean, depending on what, as I said, your individual features are, you would perceive things very differently. You could have two people standing shoulder to shoulder viewing the exact same thing and would assess that threat very differently.
And that's sort of on the risk assessment side that we're going to get to. Would you agree with me?
Yes.
They're definitely related, but it's more properly in that section.
Yes.
All right. Now, one of the things that's interesting that you talked about, well, if you're capable, if you know martial arts. Now, I know that you do. And so I know that I don't. And so if you got close to me and I perceived you as a threat, I would be very threatened. You not knowing me or whether I knew martial arts, you know martial arts, so you probably think you can handle yourself. What I'm asking you now is, if there's an individual that you don't know anything about them, how does that factor into this threat assessment? In other words, all these things we talked about, darkness, out of place behavior, close proximity. So if you don't know anything about this person, does that make this person less of a threat, more of a threat, or still a threat because of the totality?
I think more of a threat. I think, if the attack is on, now we're talking about threat assessment in the course of an advancing threat, you generally assume the worst. And you don't know, for example, if this person, whether they know martial arts or they don't, or they're bigger or smaller, might possess a firearm, which would, of course, be the great equalizer. So you would want to consider the worst case scenario. You'd want to watch the hands, for example, and make sure that they aren't reaching for things perhaps that are now concealed to you that could be taken out in an instant and cause great harm. So yes, for sure, the evaluation of all of those circumstances under threat are going to make you assume the very worst and to prepare for the very worst. Sometimes that preparation may be running away if you have an outlet. Other times it may be that you're forced to engage because there's nowhere else to go.
Okay, and you talked about martial arts, and I know your background in martial arts. So I guess you know the answer to this question. Can a fist cause an injury worse than a bruise?
Oh, yes.
Can it cause a laceration?
Yes.
A cut, in other words, how about a broken bone?
Yes.
Can a fist kill?
Yes.
And does one necessarily have to be trained in martial arts to be able to inflict those sort of injuries on another person?
No.
Okay, risk assessment, what does that mean?
Risk assessment is really trying to determine what the risks are regarding the actions you're about to take, or that you feel that you've settled on. And so there are other things that we started to talk about that need to be taken into consideration. For example, maybe I decide to engage in a fight because I'm left with no other options. Can I take you? Am I capable of actually prevailing if the two of us were to engage in a fight? I'd want to look at how big you are. I'd want to look at how big I am. I'd want to take a look at perhaps your apparent knowledge of fighting versus what I know about myself. I'd want to think about things like injuries. If I have an existing injury, or sometimes the injuries are temporal. For example, let's say we start fighting and you throw me to the ground and I break my arm. I'm certainly not the same person that I was just a moment ago. Now I may choose that I'll disengage from the fight and run away because I don't have that same competency that I had just seconds before. So all of those features that are not only intact, like for example your age, your size, but are also temporal, like for example your fitness level and your injury level at the moment, have to be weighed into the risk as to how you will proceed with the very next step.
So once you've determined, based on the totality of the circumstances that we talked about, that a threat is present, now we're doing a risk assessment, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, we're doing a risk assessment to determine what the appropriate next step is.
Right, what your next course of action will be that will result in the best outcome for you.
Now, when you talked about, you gave that example about, well, you know martial arts, and so you're aware of what your capabilities are.
That's correct.
You also said something to the effect of, you also may know what your limitations are. For instance, yes, I know martial arts, but I wrecked my shoulder in the gym or something like that, so I know I have some weaknesses. So is that what's called self-efficacy?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Self-efficacy, is the belief that you are capable of handling a task or not, and to what degree you're capable of handling that task. So people have a certain feeling about themselves when they take on any task, not just fighting, but any task, whether you're going to climb the big mountain or you're going to go on the bicycle race or any other, for example, sporting event. There's always a level of self-efficacy that should be improved if you're going to engage. And if you're not capable of improving it, you are at a disadvantage.
Okay. And is that, I heard the term perceived limitations. What does that mean?
So everything is based on perception. Everything that I spoke about is based on what your calculus of, for example, the environment is, what your calculus of the person's abilities are, what your calculus of your own abilities are. Certainly no one has a crystal ball in this. No one knows how this is going to end. So what we do is we calculate what we think will give us the best advantage in any type of a competition. If that competition is for medals or that competition is for life or death, it is pretty much done the same way. If I'm going to engage in this, I want to make sure that the advantage goes to me. And so I want to look at the efficacy of myself to determine whether or not I'm up for the task.
Okay. And so now an individual is doing kind of a risk assessment on his own situation. That's something you teach in police academies?
Yes.
Okay, and to civilians?
Yes.
And what's the purpose of kind of, I don't want to say setting a formula, but of giving these criteria, because certainly they're flexible. Is that true? Do I have that right?
They are flexible, yes.
So why do you teach these things?
Well, it's a dangerous world. It's a violent world, and a lot of times people find themselves in very dangerous or violent situations, and if they aren't prepared for that, they can be terminal situations. It may be the last thing they ever do. So I think most self-defense instructors are not attempting to teach people how to fight or even when to fight, but what to do if they find themselves in a fight. So it's generally what we refer to as defensive tactics. It's defensive in nature.
So is it fair to say the closer a threat is to you, that you are in a more dangerous situation?
Yeah, I think distance is always the great equalizer when it comes to advantage. Even with a firearm, if you get far enough away, then you won't be shot. It's very hard to hit a target that's much smaller, for example, that's off in the distance. Certainly as you get closer, if we put our weapons away, for example, and we start to use hands and feet, we certainly want to be outside of the range of those hands and feet so that we're not subject to the reaction time principle of being able to recognize a threat and be able to properly respond to it.
And so with a shorter distance, now it sounds to me like what you're telling me is that there are more options for the threat to cause harm. In other words, now the hands are an option if they're close enough, right?
Yes.
And we've already discussed that can cause serious bodily injury.
Objection, asked and answered.
Okay. Let's talk about reaction distance gap. What does that mean?
So basically what you just said, which is with reaction time principles, we know them to be about 0.25 seconds. The amount of space that you can cover in a given amount of time based on that constant is the baseline for so much of what we do in self-defense and defensive tactics. For example, in law enforcement, it takes time to draw a weapon out of a holster. You want to make sure that somebody is at an appropriate distance, if you're even going to attempt to do that, that you can actually get the weapon out before being completely consumed by that person because they've closed distance so rapidly. In other occasions, if it's a hand and fist fight, as I said, you want to make sure that you turn every action into a two-step process, not a one-step process. What I mean by that is if somebody throws a hand at you, you want them to have to shift their body close enough to cue you that that hand's coming, to give you the reaction time, because it's going to take about 0.25 seconds to even realize they've moved. At that point, you can assess that movement and you can incorporate the appropriate defensive response because you've given yourself enough time to do it. If you stand toe-to-toe and there is no forward movement, the first recognition of being hit is usually being hit.
Okay. And I know you talked a little bit about stress factors, and I know that your study, your dissertation had to do with that. Tell us, in a situation where there's a threat has been perceived, tell me how stress factors into that.
So again, it goes back to what your coping mechanisms are. If your coping mechanisms are not adequate to deal with that particular threat, your body will start to do things that are not within your charge. They will start to, as I said, excrete various hormones, stress hormones into your system, catecholamines we call them, that will change the way that you feel. It will change your perception. It will, in some cases, give you more endurance. It will oftentimes give you more strength. These things that I think laymen call adrenaline dumps. That's really an epinephrine or dump that is a chemical response to fear. It's usually motivated by a part of the brain that is out constantly monitoring for threats. And so those physiological changes will start to occur, and it'll oftentimes change your ability to do things like, for example, think.
Okay. And are there certain physical manifestations of stress?
Yes.
Could you tell me about some of them?
You're talking acute stress, not
Yes.
chronic stress. I mean, chronic stress is a different
No, I mean acute stress.
area.
Yes.
Acute stress that is sudden, ongoing, and the expectation is that it will be over soon. Some of those things that will occur, and I'll keep it on danger. We'll stick with danger. Is that you will, for example, have a narrowing of vision, something we call tunnel vision.
And let's talk about that. What does that mean?
It means that your eyes actually start to close in. The acuity of your eyes start to see the threat acutely to the degree that you can't see anything around it. It's often been described by people who are in very stressful situations as looking through a paper towel holder. I think that's perhaps the best image of it. I know that there are circumstances where individuals have been so stressed they've described it as looking through a soda straw. So when it's a problem, by the way, for threat assessment, when your eye can no longer see things outside of that direct threat. And it has everything to do with the amount of arousal, is the word we use, that you're experiencing based on that threat. And so that would be one of the features.
And again, that impacts somebody's perception.
Yes.
And in terms of anything else, such as narrowing of attention, what does that term mean?
Well, attention means, of course, when you are doing your threat assessment, you want to be as attentive to the environment as possible. You want to see all things. You want to be able to analyze what's important in the environment. You want to be able to gate out the unimportant things, the things that are not threatening to you, so that it's not distracting. It doesn't cost mental energy. It doesn't cost attentional resources, is what we call them. And once you can focus on the important things in your environment, then you become more acutely tuned into those things, but at a cost. And the cost is if something changes in the environment and you are already starting to experience tunnel vision, you may not see it depending on your level of arousal. So there's a fine balance between wanting to be very focused on the threat that you understand and the ability to vacillate things in the environment that might also be threatening to you, that you'll want to see in the event that they suddenly turn into perhaps the bigger threat.
Yeah. And the term distortion as it relates to manifestation of stress, what does that mean?
So perceptual distortions means that you'll actually see things differently, you'll hear things differently, you'll feel things differently, you'll experience things differently. For example, you may experience slow motion timing in a very stressful situation. In some cases, you may experience that things are farther away than they seem. In other cases, you may experience that they're closer than they seem. So your brain kind of plays these tricks on you a little bit and gives you these distortions in perception that other people are not experiencing around you. And you'll see very different, for example, testimony that comes from individuals, the one who is actually under the threat versus the one who is merely observing the threat. They will explain that circumstance very differently.
And so that doesn't make it any less real to the person that's being threatened.
No, it's very real.
Now, to prepare for this case, you reviewed materials like reports, interviews, a videotape.
Yes.
Let me talk a little bit about that. On the videotape, you could see an event that appeared to be the throwing of popcorn and the firing of the firearm. You remember that?
Yeah, among other things, but yes.
That's fine. And then between the time that the popcorn bag was thrown towards Mr. Reeves' face and Mr. Reeves fires a shot was approximately 0.72 seconds. You remember that?
Yes.
And so in looking at that sequence, let me ask you this. You've looked at the video with the timestamps, right?
Yes.
Okay. And have you formed an opinion as to whether or not Curtis Reeves discharged his firearm in response to Mr. Oulson throwing the bag of popcorn at him?
I did formulate an opinion.
And what is your opinion? Sorry?
I object.
Approach.
Dr. Bedard, do you have an opinion as to whether Curtis Reeves discharged his firearm on January 13th, 2014 in the movie theater in response to Mr. Oulson throwing a popcorn bag at him? Do you have an opinion as to that?
Yes.
And what is your opinion?
That's not why he discharged his firearm.
Nothing further at this time.
Thank you. Cross?
We have just 5 minutes to chat, Judge.
Yeah. Do you want me to, are you going to go outside or you want me to?
No, I just need to scoot around here.
Okay.
Chat for a minute.
All right. Go ahead.
Had to make sure it was still afternoon. When did you start training police officers?
In 1987,
Okay, and that was where?
at the time Lively Law Enforcement Academy.
Okay. And then subsequent to that was in service at the agencies you were at?
As well as I continued on with what later became the Pat Thomas Law Enforcement Academy. I continue to teach there.
And where is that?
It is in the same location. It is actually the same building. It was just simply taken over by the Tallahassee Community College rather than the Lively Vocational School.
And when was that?
I'm sorry?
When was that?
Oh, God. 89, maybe, in the late 80s.
And the teaching that you did was at those particular universities that you previously discussed, along with the agencies that you were with?
You're talking about the earlier testimony? Yes, I've taught all over the world.
No, I'm talking about the earlier testimony when you began teaching.
When I began teaching, I began at the Lively Law Enforcement Academy, and I continued on without break as it transitioned to the Pat Thomas Law Enforcement Academy. I still teach there.
Okay. Thank you. No further questions?
All right. May this witness be released?
Yes, Your Honor, he's on standby. Still
Okay.
subpoenaed.
All right.
Yes.
Dr. Bedard, you're free to go. If you get called back, you have to come, but I'm sure they'll give you plenty of notice.
Okay.
Thank you. Council approach? All right, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you guys, maybe it's just Wednesday, but I feel more tired than if it was like 8 o'clock already. But it is 5:16, I believe, according to that clock, a perfect quitting time for this long day. So we will start up again tomorrow at 8:30, and we are in good shape all in all, as I indicated it for our finishing by the end of the week. So, all right. Remember my instructions during the recess, please. No independent research. Don't talk to anyone about the facts of the case. Don't talk about the facts of the case amongst yourselves or anyone else, of course, and don't watch the news. And have a great evening, and I'll see you in the morning. Thanks, everybody.
All rise, court is in recess till morning 8:30.
Morning. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.